we're going to take an hour. So it's 10 to 2 now. We're going to be finished at 10 to 3, and then let these amazing people go on with back to Oxford. So the focus we want to have here is getting equipped, digging into some challenging scenarios of critical issues facing Christians today, and how we can respond to them. Okay, this is the theme. So what we're going to do is we've got quite a few questions in. I'm going to just grab one and choose one, and Michael, you can direct who answers them. And then the next question we'll take from the floor. We've got 2. So if you have a question, just think about it as we tackle this one. So this is about engaging today, so I guess this is a very relevant one. So I'd like to ask the following. This pertains to speaking with non-Christians, particularly relatively smart ones. Do you know any one of those smart non-Christians? Yeah, there are lots of them. Particularly who semi-know the Bible and posit fact after fact. What good is it? What is a good way of justifying the notion that we only follow certain biblical rules without seeming like we're picking and choosing? E.g., when one is challenged about how homosexuality is wrong, but women preaching leading men is okay, despite the scripture references. I've tried to read around the subject, but have so far found a lot of contradictory views. So how do there's a smart person who's reasoning the Bible with you bringing forth certain truth, but they say, hey, but you just picking and choosing, because in the rest of your... so do we pick and choose, and how do we reason with people who challenge us on that? Marie.
Sure. Cool. I'll start on that, and maybe my colleagues would add something. This is a wonderful question. Whoever asked this question, thank you. This is a great question to ask. My personal experience has been, again, coming from more academic background. The reason why I actually came to Oxford last year to do a program in apologetics, which basically means giving a defense for the truth, for the hope that you have within you. That was the reason, to be able to be more prepared to talk to those smart people, who have these questions. And, I think one reason I always loved people in academia, and I still love them very dearly, and they're very close to my heart, is I find that authenticity oftentimes that I don't find anywhere else. I find that genuineness and that honest search for the truth. And I think this is the most powerful thing that you see when people are actually wrestling with the truth, when people are prepared to journey with you as you are asking those questions, trying to answer those questions. This is rare, okay? This is really, really, unfortunately rare today. Michael was talking about integrity, mentioning the whole idea of how our culture is disintegrating. What does it mean, integrity? Linguistically, think of this word. It means one piece, right? When your mind, your heart, just your intellect, your soul, everything is one piece. You're all together. And people today are just all over the place, right? People are just losing it. So when you meet someone who's prepared to journey with you with this integrity, just first of all, thank them for it, and then respond with the same kind of integrity, with the same kind of honesty. And I think what we are lacking today in our evangelism is oftentimes vulnerability, just coming and being sometimes maybe able to say, well, I don't know, maybe let's try to wrestle with it together. Maybe I don't quite fully understand it. Sometimes we come and we're like, oh, I'm supposed to give every answer to every question with this kind of, top-down attitude. But let's think of how Jesus did evangelism. He didn't come, with this top-down evangelism. He came bottom-up. Ironically, it's Christmas time soon, right? We're talking about Emmanuel, which means, thank you, God with us, right? So God journeyed with us. He's the way. We're journeying with him. And so I think we can talk more specifically about questions specifically if you want to ask more about issues with women or homosexuality, probably. I'm not going to go into detail of how to answer those, but with all of those, there is a way of journeying with a person. Oftentimes it's more than a 5-minute conversation. Oftentimes it's like I have those friendships, it's 5 years now that we've been wrestling. And last year, actually, I had the privilege, the honor of seeing one of my friends who I've been walking through this kind of wrestling with and started PhD in Moscow with. 4 years later, he came to know Christ, came to visit me in Oxford, met a bunch of my friends who journeyed with him for a week after all the 4 years that we've talked about all those things. And he just came to know Christ there in Oxford 4 years later. So just be patient.
Tom, anything else from your side?
Just to sort of begin to gesture towards how you would deal with the idea that we are picking and choosing different scriptures to suit our own preferences. The field of theology is a field with structure and rules and principles in it. And when we start to look at the Bible and we start to really examine what the Bible says, then we find that themes and concepts emerge. And one of the concepts and themes that emerge are the idea of God speaking and God explaining what his character is like and how he wants his people to live. And in some of those instances, we may find that there's a challenge to the way that we want to live, the way that we want to behave. Now, I think that we should expect as human beings that when we encounter God, regardless of where we are, whether we experience same-sex attraction, whether we define ourselves as gay, whether we define ourselves as without gender, however we see ourselves, we should all expect, whether we're heterosexual, we should all expect that if we encounter God, and God really is the most amazing, holy, perfect being, then I think we should expect at some level or another that God is going to challenge each area of our life. And we're going to have to engage with how God thinks about these things, engage with what God says. And so I don't think we should ever say, well, there's no area of my life which God can speak into. There's no area of my life which there's this sort of area I'm going to have in a box or I'm going to close off the door. And I think we should let God, if God is really God, speak into every area of our life. And we should expect perhaps challenge if we're creatures and he's God. And so when we come back to theology and we come back to working through this question of the speaking God and the God who reveals himself and says things to us, when we trace the continuity of the challenge, when we say, okay, what has God said about the way we're to live our lives? I think what we find is that God says certain things at certain moments in time, and he says other things in a consistent and continuous way. So the idea of pairing is there in the Genesis story. The idea of God putting together a family unit and painting a picture of what that family looks like in very clear ways. That's very clearly there in Genesis. And that continuity of that vision of male and female, one flesh coming together in marriage, that's all the way through the Bible. It's all the way through Scripture. Whereas the statements about women, the statements about certain practices tend to be in certain moments of specific challenge or specific cultural circumstances. In fact, the complicated picture of the New Testament reveals to us that in one passage in the New Testament, there are instructions about women wearing certain head coverings, and on the other hand, women are the first witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. And Jesus welcomes women and children to him like nobody else in history has ever done. In fact, one scholar says that Jesus, in welcoming women and children to him, sowed the seeds of liberation movements and of a higher view of children. Children in the ancient world, if they were female, would have often been left out to the elements and exposed to die because people wanted male children to be heirs. Whereas Jesus took a radical view both to women and to children. And so when we start to look into theology, as Marie says, we start to see that some instructions are for specific moments in time, and some are, we trace a continuity of God's clear communication to us. The other factor in here is that there are different types of Old Testament law. There's ceremonial law, there's law that looks at and has prophetic dimensions to it, painting to what Jesus is going to do on the cross. And Jesus fulfills some of that Old Testament law on the cross, so it no longer needs to be applied in the same sorts of ways. And so totally consistently within the theological picture, we see that Jesus in his sacrifice on the cross deals with some of the reasons and some of the purposes of those Old Testament sacrificial codes and laws. Some of it just made sense, like don't eat pork in the desert because pork goes off very quickly. And in the same sort of way, we see then Jesus being the center point, the answer, the lens through which we look back and see it all and make sense of it all. And it doesn't, then we're not being crazy or just picking things because we want to, because it fits with our own current contemporary prejudices and permissions. That has to be said then, that there is work for the church to do, for us all to do, in terms of accepting people who are not like ourselves. And it's very important that we recognize that Scripture also speaks to looking to the alien, looking to the outsider, and welcoming people in who might feel like they're excluded from other environments. And that also is there too. So we've got to take that very seriously as well.
Okay, so what I've heard is from Marie that we need to consider integrity. We need to be humble enough to recognize that there are areas that are difficult. We should be confident to say, I don't know, and I don't know is sometimes the best answer you can give. All right? So everybody say, I don't know. Okay. If we learn to say that confidently, you do not, your faith is not a failure because you don't know something about the Bible, is what I'm hearing. Okay. Saying I don't know, and often, the other thing is what I'm hearing Tom say is I guess we got to understand the Bible and I think invite people to the conversation. But I would say, like you said, just lift Jesus up as the main thing that you're talking about. I know some people who today are having lunch with some friends talking about which view of the end times is the right view. And I'm thinking, you're wasting your time. You know, I mean, these are not the important conversations of our day. You know what I mean? So let's keep the main thing, and recognize this. If someone's really interested in women and those things, say, invite them for a coffee and a long talk, and 4 years later they'll come to Christ. Okay,
Amen.
but this is a real challenge. Thank you for asking that question. Let's have a question from the floor. Okay, we have hands up. Who wants to ask a question? All right, we have. Well, you right there, and then we'll go to you next. Okay. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting to get the mic so quickly, but I guess one point that often comes up in the discussion you have with intellectuals, as you said, is this dichotomy between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And all of a sudden, I see myself trying to, as Bill and Mars would say, lawyer myself out of some things of the Old Testament that look terrible. And there's no need to go into the details of the Old Testament, but there's some things that just don't work, and there's some things we don't want to follow, and we know that. So how do you reconcile, I guess, the loving nature of the Old Testament, the loving nature of the New Testament, and the sort of more less loving nature of the Old Testament?
Good question, relevant question. How do we reconcile the old and the new, and the God of the old and the God who is good that we sang about today? Michael, help us.
Okay. If you want to, there is a talk I have online called God of Love, God of Judgment, ? And it is a half an hour answer to that question. So it's free, and you can download it. But let's just say two things, first of all. Number one, you're going to read about God's love and judgment in both the Old and the New Testament. So in the book of Jonah, for example, which is one of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, Jonah complains. When he preaches a message of forgiveness and the people repent and are forgiven, Jonah is angry, and he says, God, that's why I didn't want to preach to them. That's why I run away. I know you're a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. Now, O Lord, take away my life. So Jonah's complaint about the God of the Old Testament is he is too loving, too kind, and too forgiving. That's his problem. So the idea that the God of the Old Testament is full of wrath and vengeance and the God of the New Testament is full of love can be solved by the complicated process of reading. And you will read of both. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say, just very, very broadly, is these two things don't go against each other in the way we think. What we're saying is, look, that if either God is loving, okay, in which case he always forgives, or he is judging, in which case he punishes, and those two are contradictory. And we're inadvertently sending truth and love against each other. And you cannot do that. The idea that love can exist in the absence of truth can easily be described by anyone in this room who has ever had someone say to them, I love you, and the person who said those words wasn't speaking the truth or wasn't committed. And if you've experienced the pain of that kind of betrayal, you know the idea of truth love in the absence of truth is meaningless. Now, I often try to answer this and illustrate this by quoting from a group of very famous contemporary philosophers who wrote a whole philosophical treatise on this issue. They're called the Black Eyed Peas, and their treatise was called Where is the Love? It was very popular about a decade ago. And if you're familiar with their system of thought, one of the things they say this: the truth is kept secret, it's swept under the rug. If you've never known truth, then you've never known love. The truth is kept secret, it's swept under a rug. If you've never known truth, then you've never known love. They are 100% correct. When we are looking for love, the words I love you are meaningful when the person who speaks them knows about you. Okay? The words I love you are meaningful when the person knows the real you. And most of us are so desperate for intimacy in our lives, we project a false image of ourselves to other people hoping they will like us. The trouble is people fall in with the image and not fall in love with the image, and they don't fall in love with the reality, which is why you can be very popular, very rich, very famous, very beautiful, and terribly lonely. Because people only ever fall in love with the image. If there are people, however, in this world who know the real you, your weaknesses, your shortcomings, the dark side to your character, when those people say, I love you, that is what is meaningful. Because those people are making a true judgment, notice that word there, about you. True love doesn't exist in the absence of judgment. True love exists in the presence of it. That's what makes those words meaningful. And God's love works exactly like that. His words of love spoken over us do not come in the absence of judgment. They come in the presence of it. He knows exactly to whom he is talking. He knows all of our weaknesses and our failings, yet he loves us. That's what makes his love incredible, mysterious, and also so precious. So we have to be careful not to set these two things at war with each other. Just one last cultural example. I've been using this quotation for a very, very long time because I just love it so much. But Jane Austen's book, Pride and Prejudice, which is a very enduring love story in the English language, possibly is going to be one of the most enduring love stories, along with one of two of Shakespeare's. There's this wonderful scene, if you're familiar with the book, where Darcy, who is the hero, meets the heroine, Elizabeth, in a room alone. And as soon as he meets her, he apologizes and he goes to leave because he can't remain alone in a room with a woman to whom he is not betrothed. Okay? He's an English gentleman. You can't be alone in a room with a woman if you're not engaged. And as a father of two daughters, I believe this to be biblical, godly, and essential. And he is about to leave the room and he stops. And he re-enters the room and he says, "It will not do. My feelings cannot be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how much I ardently admire and love you." Now that line is a winning line. Okay, it's pretty good. However, he goes on to say that he loves her even though it goes against his will, against his reason, and against his own better character. She rejects his declaration of love, and being a man, he can't understand why. So he asks for an explanation. "How, I may inquire, how you so easily dismiss me?" And she says, "You told me that you loved me, even though it went against your will, even though it went against your reason, even though it went against your own character." In other words, she is saying, you told me that you loved me, even though it went against all better judgment. And she's right. True love exists in the presence of judgment. It doesn't exist in the absence of it. The judgment that we read about God in the Old and New Testament isn't something that's at war with his love. It is because he is love. And that's what's happening. And one of the reasons I think so many people are so terribly lonely in this world is they're looking for love in the absence of judgment. No one really knows them. There's no genuine connection, and they're wondering why it leaves their heart empty. The words "I love you" are most meaningfully spoken when the person who speaks them knows you, everything about you, and they love you. When those words are spoken in ignorance, you may desire to hold on to them, but you live in fear that if people discover who you really are, that you'll lose their affection. But that's not love. Anyway, there's so much more that could be said about this. But if you listen to the talk, you'll find what I've just said and various other things up there available for free.
Right, so there was the question about the old and the new, and I would just say, well, start with the new, not with the old. Okay. Read the old in the light of the new. But that's, and it's a complicated question. It's not one of those, I think if we think about just one-line answers, it's going to maybe take a half an hour over coffee or a burger, and are we willing to do that? Here's another one, before we take another from the floor. This is about engaging today. So this question is, how do we share the gospel or our own experience of God's work in our lives in a work world? Okay, so this is somebody asking. We've all said, let's go and share the gospel in our work world. In a work world where what we say could easily be construed as discrimination and land us or our employer in hot water, often with financial or other penalties. So how do we say go and share in a work world? How do we do that without messing it up?
Yeah, and I love the heart behind this question. I've found something and I want to share, and I want to do it in a way that's sensitive and legal and careful, and that's really a great way to come at it, isn't it? When you're in a position of authority, I think it changes a little bit, because you might have just to be slightly more sensitive and slightly more careful with how people perceive you to be invoking that authority if you have a conversation about your faith. And it may be necessary just to be careful in the way that you put that across. You could maybe say something along the lines of, look, I'm talking to you not in a professional capacity now, but as a, not as your boss, but actually just as a friend, and maybe you'd like to talk a bit more outside of work about these things. And it might be that protects you a little bit from being perceived as assimilating or bringing together the authority that goes with your job role with having a conversation about faith. I think that's just something just sensible and shrewd that you might just think about doing. But I think the conversations that actually are really, really meaningful, many of us spend more of our time at work than anywhere else. And so it's a wonderful mission field. It's a wonderful opportunity. We're mixing with people of all sorts of perspectives and views, and we learn about sometimes the needs of our co-workers. And there are all sorts of suggestions that I'd love to make if we had time to chat more. And maybe if this is your question, you'd love to come and ask me a bit more at the end. I'll give you some more time and sort of try and throw a few more things. But here's a few nuggets for you to think about. First of all, find out what their needs are. Find out where they are. Find out what's going on with their family. What's going on with this co-worker or this friend's life and situation. What are their practical needs? And also, what are their questions that they're asking as well? And it may be that you can just begin quietly by praying and just saying, Lord, would you begin to help me to see how I can meet these needs and answer these needs of this friend or this co-worker? How can I get alongside them? And it may be that you just open a door to talk through the way you serve them and the way you think about what they're going through and the way that you pray for them. And it may be appropriate to say to them, look, just want you to know that I know you don't necessarily believe the same stuff as me, but I'm praying for you. And I'm holding your needs and what you said, what you shared with me in that car journey we had to do for work. That really touched me, and I just want you to know, if it's okay with you, that I'm going to pray for you. And if you ever want me to pray for you, I could pray for you now if you want. But it might not be appropriate in every circumstance to do that. But you can just let them know that there's a prayerful vision that you have over their life, and that God's interested in them. In other words, because he's also listening to your prayers. And that can really open wonderful doorways. Second thing I would do is to figure out what questions they are wrestling with. What are the things they're doing? Are they despondent, disconnected, lacking passion? Are they apathetic? And do they need to find something to live for? Or are they asking thorny questions about science and faith? Do they love contemporary music? And do they just spend all their waking hours going to gigs and listening to music? And there are questions in each of these areas. Why don't I have passion like I used to have? How do we handle science and faith issues together? What is it that I'm looking for when I look for the latest music? Or what is it that I hear in these lyrics that really speaks to me and makes me feel? What is it about the experience of being out and being in community that I love? And what does that point to? And I think that by asking questions, we often open the greatest doorways for the gospel. Francis Schaeffer, who's one of my heroes, said that if he had an hour with somebody, he would spend 55 minutes asking questions and listening, and then in the last 5 minutes, he would know where the person was. And I think often the conversations where we end up in hot water at work are because we do that the other way around. We spend 55 minutes talking at somebody, and then we spend 5 minutes at the end listening, saying, did you hear what I said? Instead, maybe we could reverse it and we could say, look, where are you? Well, what are your needs? What are your questions? I do think that people are, the hospitality is at the key of this, and that the more we can do in terms of sharing our lives, in terms of going for supper after work or inviting people over to our house, maybe for Sunday lunch or maybe to do something on a Saturday, that is really key to drawing and showing people what God is doing in your family, what God is doing in your life, and having the opportunity to know them a bit better. Many people have a very immediate and close sense of family connection, and they are connected to global issues, but they have no mid-sized community. And the richness that you have in your life by being part of a church community, this sort of this larger community than just family or just an isolated group of friends, is a deeply rich and amazing thing. And so if you can invite them into experiences of that community, that also is hugely valuable. There is a hunger for community at the moment in people, something to belong to, something to do, some sort of focus in their lives. And that also could provide a really good bridge. So pray, ask them questions, listen, serve their needs, invite them into your home, offer hospitality, be generous with your time and with your energy, and keep praying for them. And I've seen some really hard nuts come to faith, so I'm full of faith for you to see some of the people around you to come to faith too.
That's great. And this is a difficult issue, I know. This is not an easy one. You're sitting next to atheists, you're sitting next to people who have all different opinions. And we can ask for wisdom. And thanks, Tom. Those were some great ideas. Let's take one from the floor on this side here. We had a hand up at the back. I'm going to be like Jonathan Dimbleby and say take a few, and then we'll sort of agree has anyone else got the same question? So Dennis, up at the back, there's a hand. There, and then down here. And we'll just try and merge a couple of these questions. And Martina's up at the back there. Go for it.
Thank you. I've often thought about this. As individual Christians, we're obviously called to forgive our enemies or love our enemies and turn the other cheek. But what do you do in the context of, let's say, aggression towards you, whether that's now as an individual or on a, as we've seen in the world now, on a national level or towards a particular group of people? How should we respond to that as Christians? What's the biblical perspective on, simple things like, should we, if there's conscription, do we then now object to that and not serve because we're pacifists in that sense, or do we actually take up arms to defend what is a righteous cause? But then there's other questions, ethical questions around that start getting opened up. How do we deal with those, let's say, not quite contradictory, but certainly clashing requirements?
All right, let's take this question here as well. Henrietta, go for it.
How would you reach a young teenager who's wrestling with the issues of the Big Bang theory versus creationism, and they're drawn into that?
Okay, so has anyone got a question relating to just that? Just here we go, up front here.
Yeah, my question is similar. I was talking to a friend, and she was saying, so she just went to the British Museum and saw dinosaur fossils, and say, how does that relate to Genesis and like the story that we have? And she's saying, I actually just believe in science, and since I can't see God itself, like I know, like she's saying to me, I know you have your feeling, like you could feel God, but I can't, and I can only believe in logic and evidence. And how do you reply to that?
All right, let's tackle that one up. Let's tackle that one up there. Okay, the issue of our response. Okay.
Well, why don't I speak to the war one, and maybe you two can speak to unless you want to add something in. First of all, let me recommend a book. It has a strange title, In Defense of War. It's written by a professor at the University of Oxford, Nigel Biggar, Biggar. He is a professor of ethics and theology at the University of Oxford. The book he wrote is incredibly readable, possibly the most readable, fluently, elegantly written book, the most of an academic type I've ever read in my entire life. So it is incredibly accessible, but incredibly well researched. So if you really want to think through that issue, I would say try reading that. Start there for a start. I think it will help. The question that you're asking, you've already introduced some distinctions. Is there a difference between how I might respond personally, in my sense, when something comes against me? What happens about when it's something which is corporate? Now, God never delineated the authority to declare war to the church. He delineated that to the state. And we're members of different nation states. And we read in the book of Acts that God has determined their borders and the times of their existing and the nature of their territory and so on. So that's something which is very important. So you're already making some distinctions. Does that make sense? You know what? Maybe it's different when someone's coming just against me personally, how I might respond, to when the state is making a response and I'm part of that state. How then do I understand my part within that? So you're already on the right kind of track. Does that make sense, even in the way you structured your question? Try reading that book, see if it will help. I really think, I don't know anywhere where so much ground is covered in such detail and so well footnoted. If you want to read the opposing case, the two most clearest minds in the world who would want to oppose what Bigger says, he deals with them in his book. So if you buy that book, you will find a summary of the arguments from the opposing side, and also you can order their books and articles from there, depending on how much detail you want to go into. The two people writing from the other side, who are the most well-known today, have both published like 1,000-page books. So without giving you sort of, 3,500 pages of homework to do, why don't you read that one there? Because it has some very, very, very useful and very fair summaries of the arguments on both sides, and you can use it as a springboard to look in. Just very briefly, though, the historical position of the church has been there may be times where we need to stand up to oppose evil. And it may involve us laying down our lives in the process of doing it. But it has to be very clear about why and the context and so on. And there's a very long and rich tradition to that. And there are no easy answers. The simplest thing I can say to you is that some situations are so terrible that there are no good options left. And we're asked to choose between a series of bad options. Does that make sense? This is bad, this is worse, and that's even more worse. And that's why the church has a doctrine called about conflicting absolutism. What do I do when I see different principles come into conflict with each other? All the good options have gone, and now I'm left with a series of bad ones. How do I discern and choose, those in a really difficult situation? And actually, the Scripture does handle that, and I think actually does it pretty well. So have a look at that book and deal with it. I do think there are times where we're not left with any other option, and we have to be prepared to stand up, even if it's going to end up costing our lives. It's a huge thing for someone else to have their life taken from them. But that's why the Bible's always distinguished morally between murdering and killing. And the two are not the same. And the question, it's a moral distinction. When is killing murder? Make sense? And therefore you should bear the full force of the consequence of what you've done. And when is killing some, for whatever reason, become a necessity? To make sense? And even though it's still a bad thing, was something that was necessary because there were just simply no other options left. And I think being able to make that distinction for us is very important.
Okay, we're going to go on to the science and God question now. I would just say, for those of you who are part of Every Nation here, we have a 3-part series that we did this year before the elections called God and Government. And I think it is critically important that we understand our own personal responsibilities, the role of the church and the role of government. If that's not clear in your mind, I think you're just going to talk nonsense. You're going to misapply truth. You're just going to be a mess. So you need to understand the role of government. You need to understand the role of the church. You need to understand who's got to turn the other cheek and who's got to take an eye for an eye. If you don't know that, you are just going to talk nonsense. Okay, so 3 messages on God and government, very well worth listening to, and it won't take 1,000 pages. Okay, let's answer that question, Marie or Tom, about, so we're really talking about, I think it's that classic, has science disproved God, and what can I say about that?
Love this question. That's a great question. The nature of my degree was that I had to take classes both in humanities and in sciences, and it was kind of interesting when I studied in the States. Whenever I would cross the road from the faculty of humanities to the faculty of sciences, it would the atmosphere would change. So in one classroom, I would feel free to kind of, in philosophy, still raise questions of God, meaning, language, and have all of these interesting discussions. I would cross the road, go into the other faculty, and immediately, the moment like people would hear, I'm a believer, I'm a Christian, they would roll their eyes and be like, oh, surely you cannot be a scientist and a Christian at the same time. Surely this is like absolutely impossible. And I read a lot of books by Richard Dawkins, pretty much everything he's written, I think quite interesting writer. But one of the things he says is, I believe that Christianity and science offer competing explanations for the nature of reality. Sounds very smart, right? But actually, like you think about it, what in fact this thing is this 100-year-old warfare model, this idea, which in fact is a myth. This myth that science and faith are in utter and absolute conflict. They're not friends. They're not even frenemies. They're utter enemies. You know, they have nothing to do with each other. Well, if you want to know more about this topic, read books by Professor John Lennox, because he brilliantly explains all the details of this conflict. But if we kind of like just look into that briefly, let's start with the origins, right? When you ask questions like this, you want to know how did the story begin, right? Because everything about us is essentially a story. We all live by a certain kind of story. It's called a narrative, a meta-narrative, the story you live by, right? And so essentially this warfare model is another meta-narrative, another story, which a lot of people buy into. Now, let's think of how did science start? Does anyone remember what was the century when science began, basically? What was when the scientific revolution happened? Well, it was around 16th century, right? The 16th century scientific revolution. So what happened back then? Why did it happen? And Popper would write about the scientific revolution's whole idea that it wasn't the increase of information. It was the result of changed mind. There's something that happened in the West, which we know was the Christian West, that actually caused the beginning, the start of the scientific revolution. And I suggest to you that that was the belief that there is a lawmaker. This is what C.S. Lewis, brilliant C.S. Lewis, whom we all have read, writes about it. He says that the scientific idea, that people believed in science, believed that there's a law because they believed that there is a lawmaker. And this is not a coincidence. Think about it. We were introduced to philosophy in Greece. We know so much of beautiful ideas and art coming from India and so on and so forth. Somehow it was the Christian West that brought in the idea of science, the idea that the world can be explored, that there is the truth, that there is a law behind it. And this is not a coincidence. And from there, science started developing. From there, we see all these brilliant scientists who are Christian today. Again, this is not a coincidence either. So I think if your teenager, it might be your child or someone you know, is struggling with this question, a lot of children would be struggling with this question growing up today because this is what they're fed. The meta-narrative they're fed is that there's nothing but matter, basically. But my suggestion would be to just gently kind of ask them to explore that more, to ask more questions, to explore other narratives, and try to see that actually this myth of a conflict does not really work. Rather, it is a dialogue, it is a conversation, because basically one asks the question, how? Which science is basically the question, how? Another one asks the question, why? And just because there is an answer to the question, how, doesn't mean that there is no answer to the question of why. If you put on a tea kettle, you know, there's this popular idea of like, if I had a teapot boiling right now and you ask me why the kettle is boiling, well, I could give you a long answer of all the stuff that is happening right now and that the molecules, and there's this increase in kinetic energy, and so the water is boiling and shaping those bubbles and so on and so forth. That is the right answer, right? That is a legitimate answer. But just because I can explain the whole process to you doesn't mean that there's not answer to the question why. And the question why would have the answer of, well, I just wanted a cup of tea, right? So there is meaning to our lives. I think that's the most sad thing that happened with science. It kind of today produces the illusion that our lives have no meaning, and we intuitively have that sense. We know that there is a reason, there is a meaning, there's more to life than this. And part of my story becoming a Christian was actually coming to the point of knowing that there is more to life than this. I'm not just a bag of chemical fertilizer, you know. And so that is another thing to think about.
I love all that. One of the things that occurred to me is that Paul, the Apostle Paul, in this passage we've been looking at this morning, goes on to, I think, speak incidentally into some of this issue that you're asking questions about. He when he stands up in the Areopagus, speaking to after he's been in the marketplace, and then he's taken to this ruling council on Mars Hill. He says this, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I found an altar with this inscription to an unknown God. Now what you worship is something unknown. I'm going to proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the places set for them, and the exact places that they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our own being." Sorry for reading all of it, but it's relevant. "As some of you, your own poets, have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he's set a day when he's going to judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He's given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." So I just want to make just a very quick point here. That is, Paul doesn't go into depth in terms of the how of creation when he is talking to somebody about God. He, in fact, guides people through saying, okay, however God did it, in other words, whether he used this long process, whether he used a short process, however he did it, it all points to his authorship. It points to his care of creation. We're stewards in that creation. He made us. He's hoping that we reach out for him. And so that we can't miss it, he sent Jesus and gave proof to everybody by raising Jesus from the dead. So he's not getting bogged down in some ways in this deep discussion of how, as Marie said, but that doesn't exhaust something of its meaning. There still could be a why. Giving us the how doesn't always tell us the why. And here we have the why. We have the why also in Genesis 1. The who is the why. It's him, the triune God, who reveals himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And you've got that as well in Genesis. The Spirit hovering over the water, the Son creating, the Father initiating that creation. I think you've got that again here, a vision of that in Acts 2. So my advice to you would be just in those conversations, don't be too tied to a particular model of how, knowing that the main thing is that God is the why, and that Paul points towards Jesus as the justifying reason for how we know God is there and how we know he loves us, how we know he's reaching out for us. Paul, as you will notice, doesn't sink the roots and the foundations of his faith on a specific interpretation of Genesis. He sinks his roots and his confidence into the speaking God who's revealed himself in the person of Christ. That's the foundation, Jesus. So that would be my encouragement to you, to be pointing towards Jesus, taking the question seriously, but knowing the limits of actually explaining the mechanism of something doesn't give us the whole meaning of it as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Can I just have a little commercial here for a book in our own family, Pastor Rice Brooks, the God's Not Dead book, and the I don't know if any of you have seen the God's Not Dead app on your phones, Android and an iPhone. If you want some really good answers to these in video, really concise, a lot of these questions, we've got loads of questions coming in. A lot of them will be answered if you engage with the God's Not Dead app, so you can engage with the world. There are some really classic little video clips that'll capture what these guys would say in a way there too. But moving on, we're talking about culture today and seeing what's going on. Here's a question, okay? How do we choose what we allow our children to see? And let's take that a little broader. How do we choose what we allow ourselves to be exposed to? Because once we start getting provoked and we start saying to know all the stuff that provokes us, and it says here, look, I mean, all the stuff that we think the Bible is against tells us if we switched all of that off, if we were, and this applies, there's another question, same on teenagers, if we were to filter out all of that from our kids, our teens, and our own lives, I feel like our kids and we won't be able to see anything. How do you filter out what you actually do expose yourself to and not? Will we have a life once we say no to all that stuff?
One approach, I've got 3 children, and my children are age 5, age 3. I've got a little girl who's 5, a boy who's 3, and another little girl who's 6 months old. So I'm with Michael in terms of the restrictions on men and women not being betrothed, spending time together. I also have shotguns. One approach was the approach of the Pharisees, who said, look at the world, look at culture, we're going to get dirtied. We've got to just separate ourselves, be monastic, kind of disconnect completely. The problem with that is that we've all got these, and the smoke comes under the door. It's around us everywhere in culture, and you can't actually totally isolate yourself. So you're going to have to engage with it, even if you try to completely pull back and withdraw. The other problem with it, with the Pharisaical approach and being a Pharisee, is you tend to put confidence in that system and not in the Holy Spirit of God. The other side of the extreme is that we become what I would call a cultural glutton, where we just eat everything in culture and we just consume everything. And I think we become like Demas in the early church. We find we lose our saltiness. We become compromised to the world. Sometimes I ask people to indicate to me whether or not they would consider watching a film because of strong sexual scenes in it. And normally, with most groups of people, that 90%, 95% of people would say, yes, there would be certain sex scenes in a film that would stop me and forbid me and make it difficult for me to watch it, because I realize that may have a damaging effect. I'll be left with the images afterwards, and that would be a concern to me. Now, if I repeat the question but say, well, what about violence? What about other things in films? What about, kind of callousness towards human life? Would that stop you watching a film? It's very interesting. Only sort of 10, 20% of people would indicate that, or tended to have indicated that would be a reason to stop them watching a film or stop them seeing something. And so I do think there's an issue there. And as Michael was saying this morning, that there's an issue in terms of what we're becoming compromised to in the world. And sometimes we have these blind spots, and these things that we think aren't affecting us really, really are. So the other approach is cultural gluttony. We get compromised. Pharisaicalism, cultural gluttony. I think both extremes are mistaken. Somehow we have to walk a line in the middle. We have to somehow walk like Paul walked in Acts 17, where he is engaged with the world, but not compromised and not being defined by the world, but being defined by God and who God says we are. Now, when that comes to children, I think we need to be especially careful because of the nature of the internet, because of screens, and the generation that's coming. I've been doing quite a lot of research on it recently. Generation born 1996 to the present are so engaged with games, they're so engaged with phones, they're so engaged with tablets, that actually the real challenge is going to be getting them outside and getting them doing healthy things outside as well. They're terrified, and 65% of them report an anxiety about the immediate future because they're worried about all these global threats that might affect them. They're very connected at a global level, and they share all sorts of intimacies, sometimes too much, with each other on their devices. And it's those sorts of challenges, actually, that are at the core. Why are they fearful? What is making them fearful? Are we, as we parent them, are we causing a fear in them? And do we need to help them with that fear so that they don't become a prison to it? As well as protecting them and having appropriate internet controls around them so that they don't stray into things that that will harm them and rob them of innocence. Very practically, what we do in our house is that we just turn off Wi-Fi when they're using a device, and it works quite easily. Just switch it off. Amazing thing. And I think actually all of us probably need to exercise that sort of restraint from time to time too. We need to ask ourselves and go into those things with our kids too and say, well, what are the values that are being talked about in this cartoon? And I quite like watching sometimes some of these things with my kids. Okay, it's a little bit boring and you have to sort of grin and bear through some of it, but I will go and watch, I'll watch Frozen with the kids and say, now, what do they do in the end of the film Frozen? What is the rescue that happens? Is it the prince sweeps in and romantic love wins and Disney is there and love is wonderful and the princess and prince live happily ever after? Well, actually, it's a very different answer that's happening there in that film. And I think if we can go into the media and if we can go into the story forms and into the stories and the ideas and the play with them, I think if we can join the game along with them. I remember Michael introducing me to a game a couple of years ago that he's given up now, actually, enjoying a whole new lease of life, not playing it anymore, was that he was also playing this game with his kids. They were playing it, and so he was playing it with them too. And I think if we just say, okay, there's this stuff they're going to spend a lot of time doing, and we just don't connect with it, we just disconnect with it, that's actually probably one of the more dangerous things. We need to go into those games with them, be partners with them in the games, be connected to some of their Facebook friends as well if they're a bit older, and we need to be helping them to walk this line that Paul walks between speaking into the world, giving hope to the world, not being a prisoner to the world, but equally knowing where our hope and our identity really comes from. I have loads more to say on that, so come and chat to me at the end if you want to hear more about that sort of stuff.
All right, we have 10 minutes of this left, okay? We have 10 minutes of this left. That's great. I think just from a pastor's point of view, I would just encourage us all, let's not confuse us being in the world with the world being in us.
Yeah.
You know, because this is terrible when we become those people that just think we're going to survive because we separate. We need serious wisdom to be in the world but not of it, etc. And I would say just do pay attention to your conscience as a pastor here. I would just say don't sear your conscience.
Let me suggest a Wolfie test, which is if you think you're watching something you're not sure you should, think, hey, if I invited Wolfie to come around for a meal, and watch this with me, so we could talk about it afterwards, how comfortable would I feel? And if the answer is yeah, I'd love to do that, that would be wonderful. That's a good sign. And if the answer is there is no way I'd want my pastor in the room watching this with me, then maybe, just think twice and, be practical.
Okay. I would say if you haven't switched something off or walked out of something in the last while, you probably need to pay attention to your conscience. If you haven't switched off a website, if you haven't clicked the off button, you probably need to pay attention to your conscience. Just the world we're in. That's just for free. All right, let's take a question from the floor. We got one down here. Sophia, all the way from Argentina. All right, here we go.
Okay, how do you explain... so we got the Bible, we believe in the Bible, but how do you explain to someone that it is from God and that when it's got translated it hasn't been changed and that when it finished in Revelation that is when it's supposed to finish and it shouldn't have gone on?
All right, so this is a question about the validity of the Bible. One of you, this is probably the last question we're going to take from the floor. I've got one more on here. So one of you, I know you could all say something loads on that.
I'll start.
How do we know the Bible is true?
Great question, and probably a lot of questions start with this question, right? Because if we're talking about our worldview and we're basing our worldview as Christians in the scriptures, the question is like, well, is the Bible accurate? There's a brilliant book by Amy Orr Ewing from Barry Zacharias here in the UK, who answers, and I really, really recommend that book because she answers most questions that you can find related to this topic really, really carefully, brilliant ways. So you will find a lot of kind of details how to deal with this question. But just the general question that oftentimes people struggle with the Bible is they try to read it with the wrong kind of lenses. And being a linguist, being psycholinguist, I feel very sensitive. I'm very sensitive about it because I think like when you come to say detective story, you don't expect to get some recipes in there, or like when you're reading a recipe book, you don't expect that you'll be all like feeling nice and cozy, poetic about it, There's like certain things you expect to find in certain genres, in certain books. And we know that the Bible is not just one, like it is a one big narrative, and we can see how prophecies from Ezekiel, from Isaiah, are all fulfilled in the New Testament and some of them are still going to be fulfilled in the book of Revelations. It's this sweeping, incredible, big drama narrative. It's just all happening, right now in front of our eyes, just seeing globally what is developing. A lot of it, you can actually go to Revelations and see it. But another thing with the Bible is that it does consist of separate books with separate genres. And I think people struggle oftentimes just coming to, say, Genesis and trying to read it as a science textbook. Well, it's not a science textbook. You're not supposed to ask those questions. So that would be my general big advice, apart from kind of separate questions coming to the Bible, is try to be careful what you expect to find when you're reading it. It's maybe you're just looking for something specific in the wrong place?
Thank you. I would just say that the Christian can provide really good reasons for taking the New Testament seriously and for taking the biblical picture seriously, looking at contemporary history outside of the Bible, the Greek, Roman, and Jewish writers, many of them mentioning and confirming the portrait, the picture of the New Testament that we're presented with as we read the Gospels. The early Christian communities didn't read back their concerns. They were worried about propriety in worship, use of tongues, issue of circumcision. And there's an absence of those issues in the New Testament, in the Gospels themselves. That we knew that there were concerns in the early church, which must have meant that those texts were closed by a certain point. Otherwise, we would have found those concerns emerging in that data. So we've got archaeological, historical information. The concerns of the immediate community weren't read back, which speaks to a very early authorship of those concerns. And the events of the Gospels themselves have been archaeologically confirmed, as I've just said. Now, those Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly, were written within the lifetime of the people who saw those events occurring. A scholar called Richard Borkham has opened a very interesting and new way of approaching this question. He looked at work done that looked at the popularity of certain names in geographical regions in the Middle East area in first century Palestine. And he compared and looked at, if you were in Jerusalem, what was the likelihood of your name being a popular name? And what he found was that where a name was a very popular name, Jesus or Simon or Peter, there was an extra qualifier added in the New Testament Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to make sure that you could find that individual. It was like an IP address or like a postal code with an address, so you could go and ask that person exactly who it was, which is why we have Jesus of Nazareth, why his name is popular, therefore you add the qualifier. Somebody who's son of somebody else. It gives you an exact reference point for how you can go and check out the authenticity and the accuracy of the story itself. So they were very, very concerned to make sure that you could go and check out the details. So we have archaeological, historical confirmation. None of the concerns of the early church seem to be read back into the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We also find that the use of names supports a very careful recording process by those disciples who wrote down the stories and sayings of Jesus, particularly. And then the last reason would be this. If you wrote down something that you knew was untrue, would you be willing to pay for that with your life? 11 of the original disciples ended up paying with their lives for what they believed was true and what they wrote down. 2 of Jesus' brothers ended up coming to believe in him and wrote 2 of the books of the New Testament as well. These were people who saw him, who knew him, who were convinced by him. And so the question that comes out of that is, okay, if the New Testament picture of him is accurate, as it seems to be, if even the most skeptical scholars agree that Jesus died on the cross, that his followers reported him rising from the dead, that he did this life of miracles, that suddenly the greatest persecutor of the early church, Saul, became Paul, suddenly the day of worship was changed from one day to another day, which was massive in terms of the Jewish worldview and perspective, and then James became a Christian, suddenly all these things are happening, and even skeptical scholars are saying this happened, then what is our explanation for who Jesus was? If a rational, reasonable person looks at the New Testament, they're going to walk away with an impression that it is something that needs to be taken seriously. And so therefore the question is, who was he? Who was he? Who was he? And in Mark chapter 8, Jesus puts this question to the disciples. He says, who do people say I am? They say, oh, you're one of Elijah, one of the prophets. Other people say this, say all these different things. And he says, but you, who do you say I am? He's not going to let them off the hook. I love this line of questioning Jesus uses. He says, but who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? Well, for me, as an undergraduate doing philosophy, I felt the presence of that question. But who do you say I am? And in that question coming to me, who do you say I am? Will you see me? Will you recognize that I've spoken, that I've revealed myself? I felt that God was interested in me. I felt that God was interested in my response, and that dignified me. And I felt that actually, yes, I am convinced by you. I want to become a Christian. So for me, part of my journey to faith came looking at the New Testament, looking whether it could stand up.
Great. One of the books the book we hand out to every guest here is called The Life. Now, let me ask you by show of hands, who's actually read the book, The Life by J. John? Now, boldly, just I don't know, half hands, you've either read it. Now, listen, if you want a lot of these questions, you would get some really the basic answers to this if you read that book. If you just put all your other books aside for now and read The Life, you would get some real clear information about how you can believe the Bible is true, who was Jesus, historical Jesus, the proofs for the resurrection. We should all have that book and read it so that we can get the basics of reasoning about Christ patted down, So I would really encourage you, and this is a bit of a challenge to us. This is the stuff we have to get some information on in a way that we can share it. So The Life, all right? If you need one, we'll give you one, all right? If you got it and you put it down in that bottom drawer, it's time to read it. Good Christmas reading. Okay, one more question. Martina is a journalist in the house. Journalist for the Times, I think. So, Martina, you have the last question.
I wanted to ask Michael, you spoke in your message about how difficult it is to foster leadership in the absence of commitment in the workplace, and how can we as Christians help solve that problem, and what solution can we offer in a workplace that's secular but there's no commitment among many of our colleagues? How can we help?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've spoken at Goldman Sachs and UBS and Merrill Lynch and EY and KPMG on this issue, and it's interesting. All of the senior global leadership, you mentioned this, and they all lean forward because they want to know, as employers, they can recognize it. And if you're speaking to the younger employees, they often lean forward going, oh yeah, you want it, you're talking about me. So it is a huge issue. Wolfie showed me another question which connects with yours, which says, what's the biggest single factor about commitment aversion? And the answer is quite easy. We're scared of missing out on something. We're so terrified of missing out, we're not committing to anything apart from ourselves. And therefore, we're missing out on everything. So within the church, what does that mean for the Christian? It means that every single Christian must be converted to the idea that what is right is actually good for us. Let me just say that again. It means every single Christian must be converted to the idea that what is right is actually good for us. Most of us are converted to the idea that what is right is bad for us. It's like broccoli if you don't like broccoli. Does that make sense? I know I should like it and I know I should eat it, but I hate it. Now I love broccoli and I love Brussels sprouts. I actually love those things. The trouble is, now I'm 44, they give me gas, and so it has other side effects that cause problems. Did I say that out loud again? Sorry, I'm just checking you're awake. So long as that's what we think about, the idea of commitment and holiness, that makes sense? It's right, but it's not good for us, you're going to have a problem with it. Because what you're basically saying is, God, you're against me. My career, my fulfillment, my happiness, my freedom. And that's a huge problem. That means God's suddenly become your enemy, even as a believer. So what does that look, therefore, in a work of employment? Let's put some employment. Let's put some legs on it. It means that you're committed to something which is bigger than you. It means you're committed to other people and also seeing them succeed. It means you're willing at times to be invisible so that others may be visible because it may be good for them. And people may not realize what a critical role you're playing until they've actually got rid of you. But most importantly, what it means is that you understand that what you're doing for God. God has placed each single one of you in a calling. He has a vocation, a job for you. And we're told that we do that as if we were doing it for God. As if it were Him we were serving. Which means that we should bring a joy and a commitment and a focus to it. Now, here's what I have also noticed. As I've traveled around the world, I've sometimes met with some, Muslim billionaires, Asian Buddhist billionaires, so on, and they love appointing really strong Christians into positions of leadership. And I've actually asked them point blank why. And they normally give me two responses. Number one, I know I can trust them. So there's the classic illustration, I can't remember who first gave it, about his boss saying, I want you to tell this client I'm not here. And this young Christian says, I won't lie. And the guy has to take the visit and then turns around to fire this Christian. And the Christian says, you should be happy that I wasn't prepared to lie to you. The very fact I'm not prepared to lie to you, the very fact I'm not prepared to lie for you means you know that I'll never lie to you. In other words, you can trust me. And trust is in very short supply in the commercial space. So one, I can trust them. And two, they seem to be able to focus and work hard. And you talk to any business owner, doesn't matter how corrupt they are, it is impossible to run a business without trust. And at the very center of trust is morality. And every organization in the world is governed by morality. Every single one. Now, if you don't believe me, you go join an organization which you think doesn't have it. Let's take the mafia, for example. Well, if you think morality means nothing to the mafia, join the mafia, and then after you've joined, you try lying to them, stealing from them, cheating them, betraying them, stabbing them in the back. Not only will you find they have a very strong a very strong definition of absolute morals, they also have a compliance department second to none. And that compliance department moves quickly, swiftly, and brutally. The question is not, do we have a moral standard? The question is, how far does it go? Is that commitment to ourselves, to the family, to the business, to the nation, to the world? The question is not, is there a circle of morality within which we operate? The question is, how big is it? Every organization and individual has one. And for the Christian, that circle is way bigger than themselves because it extends all the way out to God. So it should look different in terms of how we work. And what's interesting is I've started to notice more and more employers around the world, they recognize it even if they can't define it. Now, some may be prepared to abuse it and use it, but we still need to be committed to it. And which is why I think the church should be producing leaders in the political realm, the commercial realm, in every realm as never before. Because of this understanding that they're called by someone bigger and they're committed to something larger, for instance, and it applies everywhere. And we're not prepared to give in. This world is actually looking for statespeople again. It is. It is hungry for statesmen and stateswomen. And they can't find them. And it's normally at this time that the church shines with the brightest light and it also comes with the greatest cost. And we have to be prepared to pay the price and also to be that light in a dark world. Well, you're listening really well. If you like the answers to the questions, if you would like to come forward and leave large sums of money in front of our feet, we'll then go home. Wolfie, thank you so much for reaching out, inviting us again after all these years to come back. It's lovely to see some of you again. Thanks so much for having us. It's been a joy.
Yeah, come on, let's give Tom, Marie, and Michael a big hand. I know that there are loads more questions. I've got just reams of them have come into the text here, and we've tried to tackle. But I hope, as I introduced Michael this morning, that they want to help believers think and thinkers believe. And I hope that in an environment like this, that maybe we just even become aware of what we don't know so that we can personally grow and say, you know what, I need to sharpen up a little bit on this. And I want to just encourage us. Let's be integrous. Michael spoke about not being hypocrites, but let's have integrity in our lives. And secondly, let us be committed. This is hugely challenging, that about commitment, that we must believe that what is right is good, is best. 100%, and when we talked about children, the fear there, you spoke about fear was will there not be anything to do? And this is the great fear, that if I hold on to one thing, that I have to let go of so much that'll make me happy. And friends, our faith in Christ is not a one hand on Him and one hand in the world. It's a letting go. Sometimes it takes more faith to let go than it does to take hold of. Let us be integrous. and fully committed. And if your question hasn't been answered, go and search these things, because there's a world that's waiting for you and I to engage well.